So Chris, what months are you down there typically?
Most of March, a couple of weeks into April. And then I usually go for a week or so in July, and then maybe a week or two in January-ish. I just was on earlier today on the South Australia website, and they're still not letting people in from overseas. They're letting up a little bit on other states, with the exception of Victoria, where Melbourne is, and where a lot of the big outbreaks have been. Mm-hmm. But there's still, and there's nothing of any detail about their vaccination program, which is really surprising. I think that's what's holding us up the most, is that they're pretty far behind in getting people vaccinated. So.
That is surprising.
Well, they are very similar to us in their, in their culture and their language, obviously, and everything else, but they are on the other side of the planet and they are isolated. So trying to get them, and there is no manufacturing to speak of. So they don't have like a Pfizer manufacturing wing. They're dependent on the rest of the world to supply them. And, I don't know. I mean, they may even, I wouldn't be surprised if at some point they consider getting that vaccine that's being manufactured in China, especially given the proximity.
Right. So you didn't make it this year, I take it.
It's bumming me out, man.
Yeah.
I need to go down there and do blends, and
yeah.
That's it's also our launch, so I was hoping to be down there for the launch, but it doesn't look like any of that's going to happen.
Yeah.
But it is what it is, Control what you can.
Yeah.
Can't control that.
I see some people rolling in. Welcome, everyone. Have a couple more minutes till we get started. Thanks for joining us. John Blazon, nice to see you. All right, well, let's get this kicked off. Probably see a few more people roll in as we get going, but in the sake of time, and it is noon or 3 or somewhere between, depending on where you are. Never too early to get started on drinking some great wine. So I'd like to welcome everyone to meet the Winemaker session. And today we have a very, very special guest, which I have the pleasure of working with. And, you know, I can't wait to hear his side of all of these wines. They are some of my favorites. My name is Nick Hetzel, Master Sommelier with Jackson Family Wines. And a little quick intro in terms of housekeeping. Everyone is muted, so please, if you have questions or comments, just type them into the chat window. I have that open, and I will monitor that as best as possible. And without further ado, I'd like to welcome Chris Carpenter, winemaker for Hickinbotham Wines, as well as several others. And Chris, excited to be here with you. My trip to Australia about 6 years ago and the McLaren Vale changed my life in terms of what my perception of Australian wine was, what my perception of Australia was, but also just a wholesome cultural experience. And, you know, you've been making world-class Cabernet and other varieties out of the Napa Valley for decades. I think a great way to start this out is sort of what brought you to this amazing piece of property and what inspires you to make such great wines here. And thanks for joining us.
Yeah, well, thanks, Nick, and thank you for you all that have joined and taken time out of your day. So what inspires me about making wine down there? Well, the place is, if you're looking at Nick's background, you can see a little bit of the vineyard in the background, and that's that house back there is affectionately known as the White House. You know, I think to put it in context, a little bit about my background and how I think about wine, and then how I approach this project. So as Nick mentioned, I do make wine in the Napa Valley. I make wines for La Jolla, Cardinal, La Jota, Mount Brave, and Caledon. And my approach to winemaking is kind of several different levels. One, I try to make wines that are focused on the vineyard, and not only from the standpoint of the place and how the place expresses itself, but the farming and creating gold in the vineyard so that I don't have to try to create lead or try to create gold out of lead. So I spend a lot of time in the vineyard and thinking about how my farming practices can ultimately affect my wine. And if I'm doing that at the very highest level, then making wines about place becomes secondary, or not secondary, it's primary as far as how I'm approaching things. But if you're creating the really great fruit in the vineyard, then it will naturally express itself. And those two things are my prime focus. The third part of how I think about wine is from a winemaking standpoint and keeping it simple once those grapes hit the winery. And I do that because of the work that we've done in the previous two parts of my philosophy is, you know, all that work should have been done to create that gold in the vineyard, and then maintaining the idea of place is super important. And by doing anything in the winery that affects that, I'm really doing injustice to all the work beforehand. And I'm not giving my collectors a sense of what they're interested in, which typically is about these wonderful places in Napa Valley and now in Australia that express themselves differently and have their own signature of character that is interesting to explore as a wine buyer. So as I was doing all of this kind of work in Napa Valley, my colleague, Pete Fraser, who's one of the great winemakers of the world and in Australia, who runs our Yangara program, found out that one of the more iconic vineyards in Australia was for sale, and that was the Hickinbotham Vineyard. He immediately called our ownership and said, hey, there's an opportunity here. This is a vineyard that fruit has gone into Penfolds Grange, into Hardy's or Eileen's from Hardy's, into the Wirrawirra Angelus, Clarendon Hills, Australis, some of the great wines being produced out of the McLaren Vale. And he thought, given our track record of great vineyards in our portfolio that we farm and own individually, that they would be interested, our ownership would be interested in this vineyard. And they were. And Barbara Banke, our owner, pulled the trigger and bought this in 2012. With this acquisition came about a third of the vineyard to Bordeaux varieties. Now, Pete is an incredible winemaker. He has a track record making these incredible Grenache wines, Syrah, Roussanne. I mean, his wines are fabulous. But he had never had experience with Cabernet. And so Pete actually suggested, why don't we call Carpenter and see if he might be interested? And he did that because he and I had been talking for years about me taking a visit down there and exploring. And, you know, as a winemaker, one of the great things that we tend to do is travel around the world, and where we end up most times are in other wine regions. Because again, all these wine regions have their own signature, their own geography, and how all of these things come together in wines, and that exploration is always incredible. Typically, we do it as tourists, but what Pete was offering at this time was to be actually engaged in that place and to make wine there and to try to understand it. So it was at a time in my career where I was kind of looking for a new challenge. There was something going on in Italy where I thought maybe I could do something, but trying to manage 2 Northern Hemisphere harvests, you know, 2 continents away was going to be really hard. And then this popped up and I jumped on it. And I had absolutely no idea of what I was getting into from a wine standpoint, because at this point I hadn't been tasting a lot of Aussie wines, again, with the exception of Pete's wines. If you remember, Aussie wines were pretty big back in the 90s. They were collectibles. And then the Aussies in the business of Aussie wines went towards more of the supermarket brands and the big bulk wines, critter wines we call them, where, you know, they were just flooding the market with $10 bottles of wine. And a lot of the idea of collecting Australian wines kind of went by the wayside. Now, that said, the Aussies never stopped making that level of wine. They were always pursuing great winemaking. It just wasn't getting to the US as much. A lot of it was being sold in the Asian market, and a lot of it sold in country in Australia. So I came down there having not tasted a lot of Aussie wines probably for the previous 15 or so years. And my job was then to learn about Aussie wines and to learn about this vineyard. And walking in this vineyard, it's about 200 acres, 60 acres of which are in vine, and it's an incredible spot. It's got probably every degree to the sun. It's got a run and rise of about 150 meters from top to bottom. It has the old vines, younger vines, dry farmed, irrigated. It's got everything. And from a winemaker's perspective, that's really enticing because it gives you a category of different kinds of wines that you can then ultimately bring back and blend together. And knowing, after I had done my research, that this was one of the great vineyards in Australia that I was being asked to produce wines from, it was, you know, you couldn't ask for better as a winemaker. And I jumped into it, and it's a constant inspiration. Every time I go there, Nick and I were talking a little bit before y'all joined us, you know, when was the last time I was back? Well, I left 4 weeks into the vintage of 2020. I had to get out because United was about to cut off their flights, and the Aussie government was about to lock everything down. And trying to get back now is somewhat of a challenge because they're a little bit behind on their vaccine. But when I am back, being in that vineyard it's awe-inspiring. It is one of the great vineyards of the world, and we have the fruit from it, and we farm it. So some of the challenges that I dealt with as I was going over there, one, I had to learn what defines Aussie Cabernet, you know, and McLaren Vale is one of the very smaller areas that Cab is produced from. The 2 big regions in Australia is Coonawarra and the Margaret River. So what separates Coonawarra from the Margaret River from McLaren Vale? And how do they define those places by way of the expressions in the wine? So that first year I tasted a couple hundred bottles of wine, and it was great, and learned a lot about that idea of place and how place defines itself through these regions. Style. Their style is a little bit different. You know, a lot of New World wines typically model or have typically modeled their winemaking after Old World. And a lot of those wines were still being made in an Old World way. Cabernet, that is. Shiraz had kind of jumped that a little bit, only because Shiraz is king down there, Cabernet is not. So where were the sweet spots as far as style differences in Australia, and how could I imbue my style, which again is mostly driven by the vineyard and by this sense of place, how could that elevate this vineyard and bring it back? And that was the other big challenge. How do we bring this vineyard back? When we took over this vineyard, it wasn't in very good shape. It is one of the most iconic vineyards, and the family that originally planted this vineyard, the Hickinbotham family, is one of the great wine families of Australia, much like what the Mondavis or the Jacksons or the Martinis are here in the United States. The Hickinbotham family is similar in Australia. And Alan Hickinbotham Jr. was the guy who planted this vineyard. And his dad and him had a great influence on the Roseworthy College, which is their UC Davis. Alan, this is Alan's place, and that house behind Nick's head was his dream home. We still think his ghost wanders there, and there has been some sightings here and there. That's another story for another time. But Alan had passed on the vineyard to his kids, and a couple of them didn't live on the vineyard. They lived in Sydney. They didn't want anything to do with it. His son lived on the vineyard, but his interest wasn't in viticulture, it was in development. So he was at a point where he wanted to pass the vineyard on, make some money on it, and he wasn't farming it to that level of attention that you need to make the kind of wines that we wanted to produce. So we bought it, but we had a lot of challenges in there, and a lot of our first couple of years we're dealing with those challenges, excuse me, and bringing this vineyard back. And one of the aspects of my time down there has been getting to know our vineyard manager quite well. And that's a gentleman named Michael Lane. And Mick is a great vineyard manager. Now, most of what he had been farming prior to that was Grenache and Shiraz. I'm in the vineyard quite a bit, so helping them understand what that meant as far as operational changes to Shiraz versus Cabernet, or Cabernet versus Shiraz, was a good part of my job. And so for a lot of years, those first 3 or 4 years, I was helping do a lot of the farming. At this point, I don't have to worry about that because Mick is a great farmer and he's figured this out along the way. And I think we've dialed this vineyard in now. We're still developing it. There are some older blocks that just didn't make it. We're bringing those back in some cases, and in some other cases, we're replanting. So we have a whole new set of vines in there, particularly a Cab Franc that Hickinbotham now makes a 100% Cab Franc. We don't have that in the tasting today, but if you get a chance to try that wine at some point, do so. It's killer, and it's one of the wines or one of the vineyard blocks that we actually planted in the vineyard. And just to summarize what we do make there, and then we'll jump into the tasting. We make a Shiraz, a Merlot, a Cab Franc, a Cabernet, and we make a Cabernet Shiraz blend, which we'll talk about at the very end of this tasting. This is the base of Hickinbotham. Clarendon is in an area where these varieties do really well. Clarendon is the little village at the very northern end of the McLaren Vale appellation that Hickinbotham resides in. And it has elevation. And a lot of what I do in Napa Valley are from vineyards that have elevation. They have all these different angles to the sun. They have a run and rise, so you have different air patterns, different soil depths. And they have a unique geographic effect called the diurnal shift, which is this basically a swapping of air masses from cold to warm on the flat versus elevation. And Hickinbotham has that, which is an ideal spot to grow Cabernet and Merlot and these kind of varieties, because it helps kind of put these vines in a steady state position where the temperature doesn't fluctuate too much and it stays fairly even throughout the day, allowing them to really accumulate character, flavor, and depth. And you couldn't ask for a better vineyard to do that. So I was sent over to make these killer Cabernet wines and to understand Aussie Cab. So that very first day that I got to the vineyard, Pete was showing me around the vineyard, and we're driving in the Ute, which is their way of saying pickup truck. And hither and yon in the vineyard, from one part of the vineyard to the other. And we kept driving by this block that I could tell was a Bordeaux variety, but Pete wasn't stopping. And I finally said, hey, Pete, what is that block? As we drove past it for like the third or fourth time. And he says, oh, mate, you know what, that's Merlot. And I said, well, let's stop. I kind of like Merlot. And this is the spot that this Merlot block is on in at Hickinbotham is ideal for Merlot. It's got very consistent soils. It's at the very top of the vineyard, so it gets all the light and all the heat. There are no gum trees around it, so it's not really affected that much by eucalyptus, but eucalyptus affects everything over there. So probably to a small degree it is. And it's just, it was an ideal spot for Merlot. And I'm kicking under the vines. I'm like, Pete, let's make some Merlot. He's like, no, mate, we're not making Merlot. I'm like, Pete, I make a couple of really killer Merlots back in Napa that I think we have like these ideal places to make Merlot, and people are attracted to them. Let's make Merlot, and if we can't sell them in Australia, you can ship it all back to the US and we'll make it back there. Or we'll sell it back there. And we went back and forth, and he eventually acquiesced because Pete's the general manager of all of our Aussie properties. He's not only a great winemaker, he's a good businessman. And ultimately, it's going to be his responsibility for wines that aren't sold. So he had this in the back of his head. But we went ahead and made a Merlot. And the great thing about the Merlot, from my perspective, was when we first launched Hickinbotham, it was the very first wine that sold out of all of our wines from our portfolio. So that was great because the Aussies, much like Americans, are not really 100% embracing Merlot as they should, in my book. And think about it. The two of the most expensive wines in the world are Merlots. Petrus and Massetto. And then you can talk about Le Pen, you can talk about a half a dozen other Pomerol and Right Bank wines. You can talk about other Bulgari Merlots. And there is absolutely no reason that the French and the Italians should own this category. And have it at the very highest level. And I feel strongly about that with American Merlots, and I want to do that with Aussie Merlots. So that's the first wine that you have. And it's named the Revivalist for just that. We're trying to revive this variety in Australia and get people to really turn on to it. It has morphed over the course of my time there. Remember I said we did some replants? One of the replants that we did, we didn't plant Shiraz back in the block, we planted Petit Verdot. And I love the combination of Merlot and Petit Verdot. In California, I have a wine under La Jota that's a Merlot that is now a Cabernet Merlot a Merlot Petit Verdot blend. So this wine is much the same. This is 93% Merlot, 7% Petit Verdot. And the Petit Verdot lends a little bit of this savory character to this wine, a lot of that black pepper and that real kind of backbone of tannin. And then the Merlot is that wonderful, like sweet red, round fruit, and they kind of go together that way. And yeah, we don't, and I'll be honest, we don't make a lot of this. We make about, now we're up to about, I don't know, between 400 and 500 cases of Merlot. We started at around 150. So we've been able to grow it, which is a real great tribute to our sales guys, that people are into it now. And it's different Merlot than California. And again, that's my job, isn't to create a California wine in Australia. My job is to really highlight what separates Australia from every other place, and particularly McLaren Vale and the small village of Clarendon. This is a great area for these varieties, and Merlot does exceptionally well there. And again, yeah, so that's the first one. Cheers.
It's gorgeous as always. Thank you. And yeah, I mean, I think that that's sort of the key here to all of these wines, is that not only are we in the McLaren Vale, which is really well known for these sandy vineyards and Grenache and Shiraz they were speaking of, but up this hillside in this village where this unique pocket to make very, terroir driven, site specific Bordeaux varieties, which I spent 5 days in McLaren Vale. I didn't know there was any Merlot planted there, but we never went up into the hills. So
they don't like to advertise it.
Yeah, it's gorgeous.
I thought we probably should have tasted the Shiraz first, but getting to the Shiraz, I know we're running on a little bit of time here. So Shiraz. What do we think of when we think of Shiraz from Australia? Well, typically we think of the Barossa, and the Barossa is another wine growing region in South Australia. Just to put it in context, South Australia is, if my hand, if you can see the kidney bean I'm trying to form here with my hand, and that's Australia. South Australia is the state right here, right at the curve of the bottom. And in South Australia, you have some of the great wine regions of the planet, really, and of Australia. You have Coonawarra, you have the Clare, killer, I'm using that word too much, great reason of the Adelaide Hills, where they're making a lot of natural, crunchy kind of wines. You've got McLaren Vale, which again, in our area in Clarendon, great Bordeaux varieties, but then on the flat, you've got some of the best Grenaches in the world. And then you have the Barossa. And the Barossa is that classic wine region in Australia and in the world that those big, juicy, broad Shirazes come out of. It's warm up in the Barossa. The Barossa is about maybe 2 hours, 2.5 hours inland from the McLaren Vale. The McLaren Vale sits right on the coast. I mean, at the end of the day, after a long, hard day of harvesting, I go to the beach. It's 10 minutes away from where I live, which is, again, one of the other reasons I'm inspired to go to Australia. The Shirazes from there are very distinctive from the Barossa, as they are from a cooler spot like the McLaren Vale. So the Shiraz that you have in front of you, Brooks Road, which is named after the road that the vineyard is on, is a great example of a McLaren Vale Shiraz. It's a lot more floral, blue fruit, lifted. It's not as much about that big depth and inkiness, and this is a wine that has levels and complexity. And I have to further be upfront, is that I don't make this wine. This wine is made by Pete. So I make all the Bordeaux varieties. Pete makes the Shiraz, and Pete's idea is to preserve, much like me, to preserve what makes Clarendon and the McLaren Vale unique in the world of Shiraz. There's very little oak. I think it's like 25% new oak. As it comes across the sorting table and into our crusher, we only crush, we don't crush any of this. It's all, the berries come through whole. So you get a little bit of breakage, and a lot of the berries that are tiny little fermenters that give you a little bit more of that, what's called carbonic character, which is more red fruit and floral aspect. And I think it's a great example and one of the best examples of McLaren Valley or McLaren Vale Shiraz. And again, one of the signatures of this vineyard is this kind of Shiraz. So
yeah, I love the lifted high tone notes from McLaren Vale. And speaking of Shiraz and Bordeaux varieties, let's touch on the Peak, which I know was an offer. I don't know if everyone has it, but we'd love to hear about it. It is the sort of flagship iconic wine of Hickinbotham.
Yeah. So one night at one of the great restaurants in the McLaren Vale, Pete says, "Listen, mate, we're gonna have to taste this wine because I have an idea and I want to posit it to you by way of this wine." I'm like, "Well, what wine are we going to taste?" And he said, "Well, we're going to taste the Penfolds Bin 60A. This is a wine that Penfolds has only made twice in its history. It's a Cabernet Shiraz blend." This is not something that we think about in the US, blending a Bordeaux variety with a Rhone variety. But in Australia, this is a wine that's celebrated, this combination. And the 60A is at the very highest level. If you ever get a chance to try this wine, do it. So we tasted this wine, it's mind-blowing, as you would expect. At $1,000 a bottle, it better be. But it was an incredible bottle of wine. And what I've come to learn from that experience and then from making this kind of wine, which is our offering, the Peak, is that these two varieties work incredibly well together. They're like yin and yang. You've got the Cabernet that has that savoriness, that stretch in the back, that upfront fruit, and then you have Shiraz, which has an incredible amount of dark, rich fruit, and then a middle texture, and they go really well together. We have made this now traditionally since that very first vintage. It is the very highest level. It's where Pete and I collaborate. We each make our own wines separately. So I'll make the Cabernet and he'll make the Shiraz. I've got a fairly good idea which blocks at Hickinbotham will be destined for that wine, as does Pete with the Shiraz. And then we come together and put a couple of blends together and try to figure out where we agree. And it's a great process. This particular wine, the 17 vintage, is 60% Cabernet, 40% Shiraz. And this wine, more than any wine that I make, I think connects me to a great tradition, an Aussie winemaking tradition, because it is a unique Aussie blend, and it works, man. And what I've come to learn is the French have probably been doing this for a lot of years, and very cold years. They just don't tell anybody. The Aussies celebrate it, and that I think is a real great testament to Australia and to our vineyard. And you can see what our vineyard can do up and down the line, and this is at the very highest level. So,
absolutely. Well said, sir. I wish we had 2 hours to keep diving into all these and talk a little bit more, but I think you outlined the region really well. We learned a lot about your winemaking philosophies and the McLaren Vale and historical Australian wine. You crushed it in 25 minutes, sir. That was impressive. Thanks to everyone that joined us. And everybody have a fabulous day. Chris, it was an honor. And thanks for making such great wines.
Thanks, Nick, and thank you, everybody. And I can't stress enough how each and every one of you should be exploring Australia. There are so many great, not just you should explore first off with our wines, please. But there are so many great wines being made there. There are so many great places to explore from a terroir standpoint. And the winemaking over there is top notch, and the people are top notch.
The food and the coffee and everything. It's, when you can go, it's my favorite place on earth. So right on. Perfect. Well, thanks everyone again, and have a great afternoon.
Cheers.
Cheers.